Support for this episode comes from the University of San Francisco's SWIG program in Jewish Studies and Social Justice, better known as JSSJ. The JSSJ graduate level certificate program in JEDI, Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion, empowers professionals with invaluable skills, tools, and resources to connect generations and ensure inclusive growth. Courses this fall include Israel-Palestine and American Jewish Life, Generational Divides and Future Directions, Race, Racism, and Jews, and Binaries and Beyond, Justice, Gender, and the Future of Jewish Traditions. Learn more and apply. Go to usfca.edu/JEDI. That's usfca.edu/JEDI.
This is Judaism Unbound, episode 436, My Body's Keeper. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Dan Liebenson.
And I'm Lex Rofberg.
And after a couple of weeks exploring other topics, we're returning to our unit of conversations looking at Judaism and disability and chronic illness. Before we dive into our episode today with our guest, Sharoni Sibony, a quick word about an exciting new opportunity for you in the Unyeshiva, Judaism Unbound's digital center for Jewish learning and unlearning. We're less than 3 years into the Unyeshiva, and over 1,000 unique students have already taken more than 70 courses at the Unyeshiva. And last year, we launched our inaugural cohort of a certificate program in Unbound Judaism. The first cohort has been amazing, and now we're excited to announce that we're opening up applications for our second cohort. We hope you'll consider applying. It's the perfect way to grow your Jewish knowledge base along with your Jewish chutzpah base. The first step in applying is for you to head over to judaismunbound.com/certificate, where you can fill out a short interest form, and once you've done that, we'll be in touch with your application materials. The deadline to apply is July 8th. And now for today's conversation. Our guest today is Sharoni Sibony. She is a Jewish educator across multiple disciplines who has worked and volunteered for nearly a decade in Jewish educational programming and event management at the Jewish Community Centers of Toronto, Ashkenaz Festival, Limud Toronto, and the Ontario Jewish Archives Blankenstein Family Heritage Center. Sharoni Sibony also serves as the facilitator of an adult secular Bar Mitzvah program at the Morris Winchevsky School. Our conversation today will focus on Sharoni Sibony's work on a digital exhibition entitled My Body's Keeper, Provocations and Possibilities, a series of works that weaves together the visual vocabularies of communal Jewish prayer, such as Torah scrolls, cases, pointers, and Sharoni Sibony's own objects of pain management for fibromyalgia, which she has lived with for 25 years. Because this episode looks at particular ritual objects that Sharoni Sibony envisioned and that she depicted artistically, we encourage you to head over to the show notes for this episode on the Judaism Unbound website, where you can view her artwork while you listen to the podcast. So let's dig in. Sharoni Sibony, welcome to Judaism Unbound. It's so great to have you.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Well, we're excited to talk to you because we've had this series about Judaism and disability justice. Oftentimes those conversations can get kind of big picture, and I hope we'll have some of that conversation here too. But one of the amazing things that you've done is translate ideas about Judaism and disability into ritual objects, imaginations of ritual and ritual objects. And so I want to get you just to start by talking about how you think about disability and making that connection to the practical of Jewish practice.
Yeah, thanks. I'm going to start from a really personal place and start by disclosing that I have lived with a chronic pain condition since my late teens. I was diagnosed with fibromyalgia in my late teens, and the expression of that in my life has been often specific inflammatory pain, but also a lot of fatigue and a lot of ebbs and flows of energy. So where I think about it may be very different from people who have distinct physical barrier issues, because I think I need more support or more flexibility in terms of time, in terms of spaciousness around how my energy will ebb and flow, that it can be very unpredictable on any given day. My relationship to Judaism in that way is kind of complicated, I guess, because I grew up in a conservative Jewish household. And there's a sense that the Judaism I knew growing up was very time-bound, and my body doesn't like to play in time-bound space in the same way. So I've really struggled with that collision in my life, with maybe the sense of expectation of what a Jewish life in a religious context can and should look like, and then the flexibility that I've actually needed in my own practice of Judaism. So that's where I tend to start from. And it's a very specific and individualized and grounded in my body kind of experience of where I see these two things intersecting. And it doesn't feel immediately philosophical to me, but obviously it can become a very philosophical conversation, theological conversation.
So you just gave an example that I found fascinating. Right now, not all of our listeners may fully be inside of what you're talking about, but in Judaism, in traditional Jewish practice, there's a lot of things that have to happen at a particular time. And if you don't do it at the particular time, you're doing it wrong, or there's some kind of consequence. And so it's fascinating. It's something that I haven't thought about before, to say that actually could be a problem. So I'm wondering if you can now take that the next step and say, so what are your ideas about it? Like what do you do, or how do you think about an alternative?
So, I mean, in the most practical, basic sense for me, showing up to any kind of Shabbat service on a Saturday morning. I'm not talking about a life in which I prayed daily or in which I was, super strict about any of the adherences. I'm talking about, people gather at 9:30 or 10 a.m. to do a Shabbat service. And if you want to be part of a Jewish community that is anchored in prayer, that's when you show up, because that's when it's happening. And there hasn't been in my life an alternative for that until more recently, because I guess with the pandemic, a lot of things opened up on Zoom. And so one of the options, if I want to be in a prayer kind of community, then I have the option of joining a West Coast community. But I also, I'm in the East Coast, so it's great to be able to do something on Pacific time sometimes, because that might work better for my sleeping patterns or for my alertness patterns. I think one of the things that I struggle with in the local experience of my Jewish life is, how to have dinner ready on the table on Friday night if I want to have people over, or even just, I don't even do that very much anymore, honestly, because I'm so fatigued by the whole experience of having to cook, that my orientation from growing up years to now about what I kind of expected my Jewish life to look like has had to shift and change. I also don't want to presume that I or anyone else would have the budget to do a catered meal on any given Friday night. So, it was always like, there was a time where I dreamt of being the entertainer and like the little booby. And now I find that I'm often in a position where I'm not going to be able to do it. Or if I can push myself to do it, then I'm not going to be able to do a lot of other things for a few days after.
I want to flash to My Body's Keeper specifically, this incredible set of artworks you brought. It's artwork, and I'd love to hear like sort of where this set of artworks came from. And I know you brought them publicly when it first launched, but like you channeled your, I don't know, meditations, contemplations, thoughts into a set of ritual objects. And I want to share one that spoke very much to me. I'd love if you could talk just to give an example for our listeners, like what kinds of objects you were playing around with creating in this exhibition. For me, the piece that stuck out most, partially because it's something I would literally find deep value in my own life. I have seasonal affective disorder, and I have a light therapy light that I use certain times of year. I've only had it for a few years, and it's amazing the impact that just having a light therapy light has on my ability to feel decent in months where there's not a lot of daylight. And you channeled this into an art piece that is a bunch of light therapy lights combined into a ner tamid, into an eternal flame. If you go to many synagogues, many Jewish communities, they have an eternal light that is in often the sanctuary, somewhere in the building. It's this notion that you keep the flame lit. It's like a metaphor for keeping Judaism alive, whatever we want to take it as. It's beautiful. And for it to tie to the light that actually makes my body feel significantly better in certain times of year, I was like, wow, if this were a real thing, I think it would be life-changing for a lot of people. It would be life-changing in the ways that a light therapy light already is, but it would be layered with Jewish meaning that would add a level of something to it. So like that's one example. Can you talk to us about some of the other examples and more generally, like what led to this My Body's Keeper exhibition?
I think the exhibition came about, it was something I had been contemplating a little bit before COVID started, before the pandemic started. And it was something that I was toying with through a class I was taking on disability poetry. The project basically came out of a question I was asking myself between the things that I had at home for managing my own pain and managing my own energy, and the things that I had been accustomed to seeing as Jewish ritual objects in synagogue spaces. So you talk about the SAD lamp, right? The seasonal affective disorder lamp, for example. That is something that I don't know that I necessarily have SAD, but it's certainly a helpful extra device, right? So I had been sitting around with these things in my vicinity, kind of spread out over the couch and the desk and everything for a while. And then I got really interested in thinking about how they related visually to other things that I knew from Jewish life. So the Dr. Hose pads are a set of little electric pads that you stick on your body. You can put them on your back or on your arm or wherever you have certain kinds of pain, and then they just shoot a little electrical charge into your body. And it just reminded me of tefillin, of phylacteries, right? And like in a visual sense, the structure of the device kind of looked a little bit like that to me. And so I became interested in that parallel. I think the other place it started was with the Yad, the Torah pointer. So I'm familiar from synagogue life with Torah pointers, which are usually metal or ceramic or wooden extensions of your own arm. Usually they have a little hand at the end of them with a little finger pointing out, and they're meant to be an assistive device for reading the Torah. So if you're the person who's standing up at the front of the room reading the Torah in a synagogue service, you're not touching the Torah directly, but you can keep your place by using a pointer like this. And I was thinking about what would it be like if we acknowledged the frailty of the hand that we're using in this instance? How would it change some of the discourse in synagogue life, some of the things that we're thinking about and bringing to the forefront, to be mindful of the ways in which our bodies are delicate cases, delicate vessels for our experience of spiritual life? And so I was looking at both of the categories of these two kinds of objects, what I'm calling my crip ritual objects, and also synagogue or Jewish ritual object. And then I started looking at how they started to visually intersect for me so that I could, initially my dream was to actually go back to the pottery studio and make them three-dimensionally. But in the first iteration of the first years of COVID, I basically just did that as sketches toward those ideas, or painting like works on paper instead. And then I was able to put those out through the JCC gallery.
I think it's so powerful, and I'm grateful to you for mentioning the tefillin and yad. For listeners, by the way, I really encourage you to go to our show notes on the website and see these visually. The art is just like really beautiful, and also it's hard to envision these things fully in your head. And so I think taking in what Sharoni's saying while looking at it will help a lot. I wanted to bring up one other side of this, which is there's all the beautiful ways in which what's happening here is tying themes of disability to Jewish themes and weaving them into like tangible objects, where the yad is an instantiation both of the Jewish and of the disability side. And in doing so, it actually merges, like it's not two different things, right? Like it's making the claim that Judaism and Jewish objects should not be somehow separate from that which we use to heal our bodies. Like they should be one. And that's like a gorgeous thing. There's another side of it, which is kind of what I would term the this too is Torah side. Like I'm constantly looking to find the sacred in everyday stuff. And I think that's like one of the oldest Jewish things to do. Like in the Shema, in the articulation of like loving God every day or whatever, it says like, put that on the doorpost of your house. It doesn't say that because doorposts are some universally recognized embodiment of beauty. It's not like, it doesn't say like, think about God when you see a beautiful sunset. It says, put your love of God on the doorpost of your house and on your hand, because those are everyday things that you encounter, like your hands are there, and like the doorpost, you theoretically walk in and out of it all the time. And so for me, I want to go to the pillboxes. You have a pomegranate pillbox that's part of this, where you take the Jewish symbology of a pomegranate, which I won't say too much. I'll let you say your relationship to pomegranate, but there's many different beautiful ideas embedded in that pomegranate. And I don't want to say argue, you made art. It's not an argument, but you implicitly argue through this art that we should maybe see our pillboxes as a chance to instantiate Jewish values. And I actually feel like that's sort of an extension of putting a particular Jewish notion of loving God on a doorpost. Like, let's put our values where our mouth is, quote unquote, like where our pills are. So can you talk to us about that side of it, like finding sacredness in the everyday stuff of our lives?
Yeah, I mean, I think the key for me is I think I do this fairly organically at this point in my life, but also I really appreciated that in Inventing Jewish Ritual, Vanessa Oakes' book, she talks about the implicit Jewish object, like the objects that weren't necessarily designed to be used in Jewish ritual or in the context of a Jewish life, but by being used in those contexts and being repurposed in that way or being reimagined in my case with the kind of parallels that I'm trying to draw out in my art between, let's say, the pomegranate and its seeds, apparently 613 of them, we say, to correlate with the meat's foot, between that and the pill box with all of its pills, that those things then become implicit Jewish objects in my life, right? And I was really interested in the idea of hidur mitzvah, the idea of beautifying the commandments or the connections. Like in a synagogue, we're always told, I have always been told anyway, and then I tell other people, that in a synagogue, you decorate the Torah. The idea, the commandment to read from the Torah and to engage with it on a weekly basis or multi-parts of the week can be made more beautiful, more ornate by decorating it, by dressing it up in, beautiful robes, beautiful tapestries, maybe a metal plate, etc. Right? So this idea of hidur mitzvah, this idea of taking the basics of your own ritual experience and embellishing it, ornamenting it in some way felt really important to me. Partly, I think a little bit differently from what you were saying, Lex, because for me, there's so much pain and sadness associated with a lot of the things of these crypt ritual objects of my life. Like several years ago, before I made this project, I think I looked at them with a lot of tearfulness, actually. And this project was kind of a healing and restorative project for me because it really allowed me to reframe them and beautify them and look at, not literally beautify the things that I use, but to reimagine them in my mind so that when I engage with them for the necessary healing and wellness pieces of my day-to-day life, that I could also imagine that I was putting that in the context of something more sacred or higher purpose or more beautiful. One of the images I created was a Torah medicine cabinet, and I took the idea from Syrian and Yemenite kinds of Torah scroll containers, the big wooden and metal containers that they use, the very large cases. And I imagined instead, what would it be if like my medicine cabinet were as beautiful as one of those things? Being able to make that connection for myself has been part of my own process of just being able to more and more in my life make peace with the limitations of my body and also still look for those places where I can push out of the limitation and try to find another path toward some other aspect of healing. And it's also given me a little bit of strength to keep trying, even in the face of the disappointments of often with a chronic illness, like not always finding the right or a good solution. It's funny because one of the things that you and I have talked about in other contexts in our lives is that I teach a lot in secular Jewish spaces. But for me, there's also something really sacred and holy about this way of bringing God in closer for myself, to have some sense of there being transmitted through many centuries of culture and artisanship and other kinds of practices, to be able to bring that into my day-to-day routines at home for the things that I actually need. I mean, in Jewish life, we have kind of the aspirational, and we have, the things that the Torah and the rabbis and other people have kind of set for us as guidelines. And then we have the lived experience, and where do these things come together in practice, right? So my lived experience is a lot connected to these objects, to the things that I've needed to use to keep myself afloat in my life. I wanted to put those I wanted to Judaicize those in some way and connect them to something that felt holy and meaningful and spiritually rich for myself. If you can think about whatever it is that you, listener, are thinking about in terms of your own healing needs, right? Wherever your pain sits in your life, that there's an opportunity to connect through the lens of ritual object and ornamentation and decoration.
What's occurring to me is it's making me wonder about the Jewish rituals and ritual objects that we have, that we just recognize as they're Jewish ritual objects, talis, tefillin, the Torah, Havdalah candle, whatever might come to your mind. And it makes me wonder a little bit if we could have heard from the inventor of those ritual objects and they would have sounded a lot like you. In other words, I'm wondering a little bit if the tefillin, for example, those boxes that you strap on your arm and you strap on your head, were the sad lamps of their time, that somehow they were providing some kind of physical or spiritual need at that time. And we don't know that anymore because whatever that issue was isn't maybe a live issue for us today. We've forgotten, maybe it is, and we just don't know. But we've somehow broken the connection between the object and the condition that it was meant to address. It makes me wonder, what if somehow there was a cure for seasonal affective disorder and nobody had it anymore? And we had all these lamps floating around that turned on when it wasn't so light, however they work exactly. And we would be like, why do we have these? Well, they bring us closer to God, but that actually isn't the reason. And I don't know, I'm not sure if I have a question here, just curious what your reflections are.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, I often think of rituals and prayers and other aspects of Jewish life as the ones that no longer serve me, that don't resonate with me in a particular way. I often wonder about how they served somebody at some point. What were the conditions of that person's life that made it necessary or possible for them to express a ritual or a liturgy, a piece of liturgy in this way, right? And then it got canonized and transmitted. It's a kind of a funny idea, Dan, to think of the defunct sad lamps. And now I kind of want to go back and look at obsolete technologies and think about that in a different way too. Like the old, what did they have for a hearing aid device or something? Like that kind of looks like a tiny little shofar now. I'm thinking about that relationship between, what do you call, what is it? The
like
hearing aid device.
I don't know if it's called a funnel.
It was like a little horn or something, right? Like just a tiny little horn that picked the sound up in a bigger piece and then, funneled it toward the ear. I don't know, you could play around with it in all kinds of different ways, but that would be a fun project too, actually.
It makes me just wonder about ritual in general and, how ostensibly, this is something I reflect on a lot, that Judaism is supposed to help us, that it's supposed to somehow help us live our lives, and that if we used it properly and if it was itself proper, meaning maybe it's not working, it's not our fault, it's its fault, but that in principle, it should be something that helps us with our lives. A lot of times, I don't have the sense that that's how people experience it. That doesn't mean they hate it, but that means it's not in the category of things that help me in my life. If it's in a different category. There's something in the way that you're talking that has me thinking about the possibility of using, maybe it's just the sad lamp as a metaphor, but saying, the question is, what are the challenges that we're facing in our lives, whether those challenges rise to the level of disability or are simply challenges in our lives. But we say, well, one way to address that is medicine. Another way to address that is therapy. Another way to address that is assistive devices of various kinds. But maybe another way to address it is Judaism. And it makes me wonder how we could design or redesign Judaism or Jewish objects in a way that would really help us. When we think about objects that you've imagined, you're kind of Judaizing objects that are helpful to folks with disabilities or folks with various challenges. And I'm wondering a little bit, maybe it's the opposite direction. It's saying, how could we helpize the Jewish objects?
Yeah, I think that is actually a really key piece of what I was thinking about when I did the Body's Keeper project. In particular with the symbol of the yad, because for me, the symbol of the yad or the Torah pointer, when I say, how do we acknowledge the frailty of the human body or the challenges of the human body and the ebb and flow of energy and other things that go on with us as embodied creatures? How do we bring that into synagogue or other communal spaces? The yad for me was one of the most important kinds of ways of thinking about that, because it's already a kind of prosthetic. It's already something that has a kind of embodied quality, or it acknowledges the body in the traditional form of the yad, of the pointer with its hand at the end. And then I started playing around with what kinds of yads could we bring forward. For the project called My Body's Keeper, I think I just did one that was representing kind of osteoporotic bone. What would it look like if the whole arm of this object were actually acknowledging something that happens to a lot of us, right? So osteoporosis and the frailty of our bones. And then I actually did another project for the JCC Association for the Jewish Community Centers of North America. And they commissioned me about 2.5 years ago, I guess, to do a set of illustrations for their guiding principles on accessibility and inclusion when they were rolling that out across all of the JCCs of North America. And one of the principles that they asked me to illustrate was kavanah, act with intention. And the vision that I had for that was a document that is their own statement of access and inclusion, making that look like a piece of parchment paper with calligraphy rather than typed font, and having a set of yads of different sorts, different pointers kind of coming toward this document. And the idea for me was, diversifying the idea of disability and of embodied experience. So in one case, I depicted a yad that was osteoporotic bone. I depicted a yad that was the handle was a container of pills. One of the yads was wearing a cast on its arm. One was a prosthetic arm. One was a walking cane for people with low vision or no vision. So it had a number of different things kind of all pointing in toward the same document, this idea that we're all collaboratively working on this. We're putting our own voices into it. But one of the things that I wonder about is when somebody actually has to hold an object like that in synagogue services or in a leadership position in a community in some way, how does that potentially shift their own consciousness? Will it permeate into the vocabulary that they choose to use? Will it permeate into the way they give a Dvar Torah, a little sermon, or will it permeate into the way that they draft policy for their congregation or for their community? That's the piece that I think is the, how did you put it? The healingizing of the Jewish faith. Not necessarily healing. It's not about healing most of the time. It's about living with, right? And recognizing that whatever policies and procedures, all of the different things that we might engage with people around in Jewish spaces, that we find a way to do that with real deep understanding of access needs and of the diversity of access needs that people have. So for me, that's where that kind of object could come in to make us pause over those things a little bit more clearly and more purposefully.
Yeah. I want to name something that is very radical about this conversation. I don't think it's uncommon. I don't think it's like a not widely held thing, but what we have each articulated, and Dan did it very directly, is that ritual objects should serve us. And Dan said it as they should help us. And I'm saying serve us because emphasis on the us, right? Like ritual objects, if you were to go buy the book, or at least buy some books, the point of a ritual object is to help to serve God. It's to help human beings to serve God. And if you were to ask certain people, I don't know who would ask this question, but hypothetically, what is the best ritual object? I think there are certain people, traditionalist-minded people, who would say the best ritual object is the ritual object that causes people to maximally serve God. That's a different answer than the best ritual object is the ritual object that does the best job at serving the human beings who use that ritual object. Now, I could get all pantheist about it and say that we as human beings are part of what God is and that serving God and serving human beings aren't different. That would actually be what I'd want to do. But I'm really interested because let's go to, say, mezuzah, the thing on the doorpost I was mentioning. Buy the book. The purpose of that is that you have a specific set of verses about God that you put in a common place in your house, the front door, and also on the doorpost within the house. The reason why we do, I'm saying it in Sunday school teacher voice, and the reason why we do this is because we're reminded of loving God with all our heart and might and being and whatever, and those verses are contained in there. And so it's not a kosher mezuzah if it doesn't have those verses on the inside. I happen to know some people who don't have a scroll on the inside of their mezuzah. They don't lose any sleep at night over it, because for them, the purpose of that mezuzah has nothing to do with God. It is serving both them and their community. And it's serving them because it means something to them to have a proclamation of Jewish identity on their front door. And it's serving their community because they want people who pass by to see, oh, wow, a Jew lives there. I'm also Jewish. That's nice. That's a really important purpose, actually. in the world. That's not a nothing. That's not a sheerly atheistic or anti-God purpose. But that is a way that a ritual object can serve us. Now, am I saying everybody should go to their nearest mezuzah and take the scroll out? No, keep the scroll in if you want to. But I think we should name that what we're talking about, where ritual objects, they're actually not just for God. They are for us. That's kind of radical. Yeah. I'm not saying that to make people distance themselves from it, but I'm curious how you'd approach that.
Yeah, I love that. So earlier this year, I had taught a course that I developed called Jewish Heretics Ritual Lab, which speaks exactly to this kind of thinking, I think, the way I understand it. And it was in the context of Toronto's Morris Winchevsky Shule, which is today it's a secular Jewish organization. I mean, it's always been a secular Jewish organization, but today, that's how they position themselves. And I do some of their adult education. So I run for several years now. I've been running an adult B'nai Mitzvah or B Mitzvah program for them. And then I also developed this ritual lab. And we named it after the podcast that they have, which is the Jewish Heretics podcast. But this idea, we actually started with the mezuzah. And one of the things that I love to do with people is have them look at the original text that's generally inside a mezuzah and think about what is its intention and what is its meaning for them, and then to write their own and to think about what it means to come and go, to leave your house carrying some kind of Jewish values or values through a Jewish lens out into the world, and then to come back into your home, integrating that, that threshold space because for most people that I know, they're putting it on their front door and not on every other door of their house. But let's say the threshold space between the public and the private spaces, where is the transmission of values back and forth at that threshold? And that is a completely radical and different take from the traditional way of interpreting that, because most of the texts that they'll write when they do their own writing of a cloth, of a parchment piece, or whatever paper I give them, they're going to do it in a way that doesn't invoke God, doesn't even name God, but might talk about social justice issues that they want to make sure to be mindful of as they come and go. So how are you grounding yourself in some kind of Jewish teaching that is relevant and resonant for you today? How do you carry that out with you into the world? And then how do you bring it back in also? How do you and the world meet each other? And how does this object help you kind of reinforce your own values for yourself, reinforce your connection to Jewish community, maybe to Jewish tradition in whatever way that carries forth for you? And also I try to yoke it together with a teaching from an architect named David Chipperfield, who talks about how as human beings, we want both a sense of protection and a kind of retreat from the world in our homes, but also a sense of exposure and being able to engage in the world, or commit, I think what he called commitment. And so the threshold in his expression of this is the dividing line between these two modes. And of course, in reality, those two modes blur in both your home and outside your home. And then I also have a friend who wants to put some kind of astronomer's, I forget what the text is exactly, but instead of a traditional clef, instead of the traditional scroll, he wants to take some kind of scientific statement of purpose and put that inside his mezuzah, which is great. That, that's for him the core value. So it's a question of that reminder at the threshold of the coming and going of the value that you're committing yourself to as you walk in and as you walk out. It is very radical. It's completely has nothing to do with God in the ways that tradition has taught us ritual is for.
I really tried to do a very similar project in my home, and it was roundly rejected by my children, who said, a mezuzah has to have the Shema in it. And I was like, no, we have a mezuzah on the front door. This was, my wife and I had this idea that we found an extra mezuzah in a drawer, and we said, hey, we've got one on the front door and it's got the traditional scroll in it. So, and we didn't have a scroll for the other one that we found. So we said to the kids, let's write a scroll with our own wishes and our own prayers, and we'll put that one on the back door. And that'll be really cool that we'll have one that's the traditional one and one that is our special one, and only we know what's in it. We thought it was such a wonderful idea, and the kids just completely had no patience for it. It was such an interesting phenomenon. And I was like, kids, this is what I do professionally. You're really, for my reputation, we got it. Anyway, we didn't do it. So I'm really fascinated about this whole idea of the Jewish Heretics Ritual Lab. I'm wondering whether this was a one and done, or whether this one on the mezuzah was the beginning of a series or part of a series, or in your mind, if it were to be a series, What are the principles of a Jewish Heretics Ritual Lab? Like how do you imagine a Jewish heretic should go about creating rituals?
Yeah, thanks. I think it was a 6-part series, this ritual lab that we did in the fall. And I think it was very much anchored in understanding textual traditions that gave shape to a ritual and the intentions of the ritual in its various historical contexts, right? And then also trying to figure out what the ritual could mean or how it could inspire probably a much looser interpretation today. So I think it comes in line, I think, with a lot of other reinterpretations of ritual that people have done, since, well, forever, really. But let's say with the advent of feminism, with the advent of environmentalism, with like all of these different ways that we've layered on other meanings to ritual and maybe often abandoned some of their prior meanings. One of the things that I think was really interesting for me is that I teach in a lot of different Jewish communal spaces. So I'm an adult Jewish educator who moves around in different places. And I move around from synagogues and Jewish community centers and also this organization, Winchevsky. I can take the same source sheets that I put together and put them in front of people in all of these different places. And the conversations will happen so differently in each of these places. So a lot of people in certain spaces will look for the more literal, letter of the law. And I think in the heretics kind of the Jewish heretics mode, it's more about really the metaphorical possibility. I think that's a big piece of it. Like, I think that's what animates me a lot these days too. The imagery, the metaphorical possibility. And then the minute you open it up that way, it becomes so much more porous, so much more open to interpretation and reimagining. We actually looked at the whole notion of an eruv, of this boundary around community that's structured just for a weekly experience of Shabbat. It's a very orthodox kind of idea to need an eruv that is put up to create community, to allow for certain specific practices that normally can't happen on Shabbat in observant communities, but that can happen within the purview of the eruv on Shabbat. So it's like both a temporal and a spatial kind of thing that's happening there to create community and to extend the experience of your own home outward a little bit so you can carry food to a potluck or you can take your baby in a stroller or something, right? And the eruv is not an object or a symbol that can or would probably resonate with any secular Jew I know. How does it resonate then? Like what's going on there? So one of the things that we talked about was the Erev Tavshilin, this sort of Mishnaic, early rabbinic idea about being able to put a loaf of bread in a shared communal space in a courtyard so that you could sit outside and eat with people or sit outside and just enjoy the weather of the courtyard on Shabbat. And we talked about what it would mean maybe to take that idea and extrapolate for contemporary life. Like, how do you sit with your neighbors in shared space? How do you maybe invite people into your Shabbat experience if you're doing Shabbat at all? People took that conversation and ran with it in a lot of different directions, and nobody was aspiring to make an eruv or a string or anything like that around an area, right? But they're taking this idea, and I learned from one of my students, and I think this is fantastic, that I think it's in Buenos Aires, they have something called an eruv block party. And the communities, the Jewish Community Center there actually hosts this big street festival. And, it's a much more, like in terms of observance, it's a much looser, less regulated kind of festival, but it's a neighborly festival that sort of pays homage to this idea. So that came into the conversation in a really interesting way, made me want to do something like that at our JCC here, in downtown Toronto. What would that look like, especially in a year like this, where we really want to be able to sit down with our neighbors and share what we love about Jewish life and Jewish community.
So you wrote a number of beautiful, like, textual things to be a companion to the art pieces that you made in My Body's Keeper. And there was one moment that really called out to me because it felt like a powerful call to action to me and to not just us, like Judaism Unbound, but like us, the Jews as a collective. You talked about how Misha Berach, the classic, and by the way, Misha Berach is actually like an umbrella term for a bunch of different kinds of blessings, but the one that we use it to refer to most frequently is the Misha Berach for healing, although it's been rewritten in many more and less God-centered ways. But it is a tough prayer, and you called out that it might not be a great fit. My question is, how might we see this paradigmatic prayer for healing not as like, oh, that's the Jewish view of healing, that's what it is, and either I'm in it or I'm not, but as like a call to shift our collective Jewish approach to illness, to healing, to disability?
I mean, there are so many people, as I've come to learn through this kind of work, there are so many people who've been working in sort of Jewish healing spaces in lots of different ways for decades now. It was something that I didn't really see. And so I feel like I came to it late and new. I haven't tried to come up with a different liturgy, but I'll say my complaint, if I can fetch for a second, my complaint about the Mishaberach is that it presents this notion that it's a very, ancient classical notion in a lot of cultures, that a body is either able and well across the board, checking off all the check marks, or it's sick and frail and weakened in some way that either, like in the flow chart of that system, either the weakened, frail, ill body or disabled body will have either a cure that will bring it back to a wholeness that we think of as able-bodied and fully able-bodied, or that it will be on its way to death, right? And then we're sort of saying like a mishaberach for the spirit in both of these cases, like may the spirit have a calming, a peace, making peace with this experience. In that little flow chart, I don't see myself reflected particularly well. I don't think that the world I live in is going to provide a cure for every ache and pain that I have. And certainly, that's life. I feel like I should say I really want to take this out of, I guess, the disability piece, because this really is the way I think about it, a chronic pain piece that makes it, I don't want to speak for people with different kinds of disabilities because I feel like I won't do that well. For me, with the chronic pain piece, what I perceive to be this ebb and flow of energy and ruach and spirit in my life, sometimes it's up and sometimes I can go, and other times it's low. And I've really learned to do a lot of work on destigmatizing that, by the way. I think the Mishaberach for me kind of stigmatizes it. If you're not like fully up and running, that I think this challenge for me is, I think the problem is this idea of it being a binary and, loaded with expectation. I mean, also in a lot of, with some of my friends who live in more traditional and observant kinds of Jewish communal spaces, like the language of the text is still grounded in a system of reward and punishment for moral or ethical, spiritual behaviors. If your mezuzah if it's missing a letter, like if a letter has eroded and you haven't had that fixed and nobody's caught that mistake and your mezuzah is technically not kosher, then things can happen to you that will cause illness, right? So there's a sense of like a punitive piece of the tradition that I find so impossible to live with. It's not the God that I relate to, and it's not the community that I want to be part of that reinforces ideas like that. So I suppose you can give the Mishaberach a more expansive reading, but this idea that there's a curative piece. So one of the things that I've grappled with in my life is I've never known when to add my name to the Mishaberach list at a synagogue. So I have never known if it's on the days of having an acute cold, on the days of having an acute inflammatory attack where my whole body just feels like somebody has pulled a drawstring from my feet up to my head, and I just basically have to sleep it off for 3 days straight or whatever, right? Are those the days where I say it? Or because I live with a chronic condition, do I just ask that they just sort of say my name all the time? It's kind of a weird experience. And then also the Mishaberach is a period, like, for people who live with invisible disability, chronic pain stuff, there's also a question of disclosure. Like, do you want to be thought of this way? Do you want your name to be said in front of the community aloud so that people suddenly know that something they can't see in you is going on? I think there are lots of dynamics that make that moment in a service much more fraught than we maybe realize. And that could be true for people, living through a cancer episode or something that they also don't want to disclose. Like, there are like bajillions of ways that people maybe struggle with that kind of moment in a communal context. So when you ask about whether the ritual serves God or the ritual serves you, there's for me, in the synagogue life that I have, there has to be a balance there. And in the non-synagogue life, in other community spaces that I move through, that question doesn't even surface at all.
So as we close, I really do want to land on My Body's Keeper because, and I want to encourage people, I'm not just doing this so you go to our website, but like go to our show notes. It's got the link to My Body's Keeper. And I'm saying that because I actually think that this is like an incredibly important starting point to a broader conversation about creating ritual objects, creating ritual generally. I believe in our listenership, and I actually think that a typical person like you listening to this in your car right now or in your iPhone, whatever, I think that if you were to go to this PDF, look at the pomegranate pillbox and the gorgeous take on Yad, to allow this to be the brainstorm for like, what's my version of this? Like, what's a ritual object that I could pave the way for in this way, or even just envision? Because you didn't create the actual prototypes, right? Like, it was a powerful act for you just to envision them. I do hope that before Messiah comes, we will have the actual existence of the pomegranate pillboxes and the medicine cabinets and all of it. But like, you're some listener out there, how might they navigate that question of like, okay, I would like to come up with a ritual item that's part of my life that I want to Judaize, or in Dan's formulation, a Jewish item that we want to connect to the authentic manifestations of pain in our lives. How would somebody go about that? By the way, I think it's a beautiful push for us that these are not by and large holiday objects. For us, we've done a better job of being like, what would a new kind of menorah be on Hanukkah? What would a new kind of XYZ for different holidays? We've done it less for the stuff that's just, oh, you use a yad whenever Torah is read throughout the year. How might our listeners take some steps to actualize their own visions of ritual items, whether it ties to their bodies and their experiences of living in their bodies in the world, or to other elements of themselves?
My first inclination is to answer this with a totally different thing that I've been thinking so much about lately. So one of the things that I find fascinating about Jewish communal life is certainly rabbinically, I find that it is setting a bar for an aspirational model of life. And that is so much in tension with the lived experience of each of us. And so, for some people, that's the temporal nature of like being able to participate in the rhythms at the times that they're set and things like that. But another piece that I've been thinking and sitting with a lot in my life is that now that I'm in my mid-40s, I don't have kids and I don't have a partner at the moment, and I won't be having my own kids in this body. And I maybe always kind of knew that I never was going to do that. I'm not sure. I think a lot about the aspirational model of family life and the reality of where I'm at with not having my own new nuclear family, just having the one that I come from. During the pandemic, I saved my eggshells from cooking, and I washed out all the broken eggshells and I just sat with them kind of in my environment, in my home. I started keeping them in boxes, and I realized that they're calling to me to make some kind of project that is about the fragments of stories and memories and things that I wish I could have passed on to the kids that I won't have. And for me, that's also very grounded in Jewish life. So there's going to be like a ritualizing piece of that process as I work on it, I think. I don't know what it'll be exactly. I don't know that I'll make a ritual object out of it. I'm doing something there that for me is very grounded in Jewish life, but like also plays off of material that in this case, that I just had access to from cooking, like an omelet or whatever, right? But that I'm, sort of looking at it in a different way. So one approach to this question, Lex, is looking at the things in our lives and saying, what else could this be? I've trained with Jewish Studio Project. That's one of the core foundational principles of JSP, but it works. I mean, it works in every kind of creative practice, in every kind of inventive practice. You take something that exists in some form and you flip it around upside down, look at it sideways, and ask yourself, what else could this thing be? I'm not going to be the mom I imagined that I was going to be when I was young. what else could this person be? A really great daughter, a really great friend, a pseudo aunt to people or whatever, right? And a really active member of community to the extent that I can be. The part of coming to ritual or liturgy, or, a poem instead of liturgy, a poem instead of a prayer, a poem that functions as a kind of personal prayer or something you can share in community, or a piece of writing or whatever it is coming with the question of, how does this visually relate to something else? That was the question that got me going on the Crip Jewish ritual combo piece in My Body's Keeper. It was seeing the visual parallels, the structural parallels between these two things. Also, for me, a big piece of it, I come at it in two ways, through text. So I come at trying to learn a little bit of the history of a ritual and looking for the porous places in that history. So I like to read up on these things and dig in. And that's how I led the Jewish Heretics Ritual Lab. I would create source sheets and have people actually understand where something like an eruv came from and how it morphed over time and how people have interpreted it more recently with more creative interpretation. So reading can be very helpful. I also come at things from a really, I love the rabbinic wordplay. I love rabbinic wordplay that looks at the homophonic quality of words, that looks at the root, the shorish of a word, and sees where else that word appears in different forms. And then you can make connection that plays off of that. And then the question, I think, is for the Heretics Lab, I ask people often, what other rituals have we not created yet? A ritual, somebody said, for reaching menopause, a Jewish ritual for reaching menopause, right? A Jewish ritual for it could be a daily ritual for living with chronic pain. For me, that I come back to this again and again in my life. So much of it is being able at this stage of my life to sit with the good body days and the bad body days in a way that I could not do even 5 years ago, when I thought that I had to be a good-bodied person as much as possible. And what was this thing getting in my way? Ritual is going to be helpful in my life in also recognizing my own inherent worth, even if it's a day just spent watching TV rather than engaging with the world at large or being productive, quote unquote, in the capitalist model we live in. So finding rituals that meet a specific need, getting clarity on what that need is in yourself, and then trying to find a way to articulate it through language or object or action feels really important. Recognizing that the thing that you need is probably a need that is shared by others too. And then finding people who also share that need, collaborating with them on it. So there are lots of different ways to come at the question, I think.
Thank you so much, Sharoni Sibony, for joining us. This has been a fantastic conversation.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been great to see you guys and talk this through with you and with your listeners.
Absolutely, it has. Thank you so much to Sharoni Sibony, and thanks to all of you out there for listening. We hope you've enjoyed this conversation, and we hope that you'll tune in again in the future. As a reminder, we have our amazing, very wonderful certificate program in Unbound Judaism through the Unyeshiva that currently has applications open. Our second cohort is opening up, and you can submit your application right now. The first step you need to take is just head to judaismunbound.com/certificate and fill out a very short interest form, and then you'll get an email from us with all of your application materials. So we hope that you'll consider that and consider deepening your relationship to our organization. Of course, as we close out, we always encourage you to be in touch with us with any questions you have, follow-up visions you have, ritual objects you want to envision or create related to this conversation today specifically. So with any of those and anything else you want to be in touch about, you can do so in the following ways. First, there's our Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. All of those are at Judaism Unbound for our handles. Second, there's our website, judaismunbound.com, where you can find show notes for this episode and for others and all sorts of other resources. And you can email us at dan@judaismunbound.com or lex@judaismunbound.com. We're also deeply appreciative if you're able to support us financially with a gift of any size, and you can do that on either a monthly recurring basis or just via a one-time gift at judaismunbound.com/donate. And before we go, support for this episode of Judaism Unbound comes from the Ashman Family JCC in Palo Alto, California, whose vision is to be the architects of the Jewish future. The Ashman Family JCC empowers you to experience Jewish paths toward a life of joy, purpose, and meaning through innovative Jewish learning and wellness programs, community building, and initiatives to develop the next generation of Jewish leaders. Learn more at www.paloaltojcc.org. And with that, this has been Judaism Unbound.